Welcome to my kitchen. Happy holidays, everybody. This is a nice recipe for the holidays or just a special Sunday dinner. I haven't made this recipe for quite a while, but I wanted something special. I decided to use squash this time. Usually I just put the pork in the bottom of the pan, but I thought the squash would be a nice addition. So, believe it or not, that little rolling trick with the knife and cutting the squash really works well. Definitely give that a try. These things can be tricky once in a while. But I ended up using both the squash. They're butternut squash. You can use any for this recipe, whichever you choose. You could use sweet potatoes if you wanted to. I went ahead and got it peeled, which is not always easy. No matter how good your peeler is, sometimes it's rather difficult to get through the skin. But I was able to get through it. And like I said, I did use both of them. And I peeled them and then got the seeds out. I like using a metal spoon to do that. It makes it a little bit easier. And if you can find a spoon that has a little bit of a sharper edge on it, that makes it a lot easier too. But I decided to keep it in rather, not huge pieces, but bigger pieces. And the object is to keep them, all the same size so they cook evenly. So I did the little half moons. I ended up using 2 different trays to cook them because I didn't want to overload the pan that the pork was going to go in. Got these cut up. These were nice. They weren't too hard. And I was able to get just enough out of both of them. Sometimes you'll find where the seeds are, they can be a little bit mushy. But this worked out well, although it was very difficult to get it peeled. Sometimes you just got to keep trying. Find the best way to do things. Not always the same way every time either. A little bit of a struggle, but I got it. Whatever works best sometimes. Sometimes it's just taking your time, remembering you're in the kitchen to have fun. Sometimes the most mundane things end up being the most relaxing things. So I don't like to stress in the kitchen. Take my time, enjoy it. One of the things I like about cooking is it gives you something to focus on that's out of the ordinary. You don't think about anything else, just think about what you're doing. Difficult or not, it ends up being fun. And this is when I think about, my flavors and what I want to use and how I want my dish to end up. I've made this dish many times. I have never made it with butternut squash, and I've never made it with the glaze that I ended up putting on it. That's the way it worked this time. And like I said, a sharper spoon helps get those seeds out a lot easier. And when your squash is riper, I think they come out a lot easier too. But I have a nice little bin that I keep on my cabinet door that I can put all my trash in. Makes things a lot easier when you're cooking. I'm not the neatest cook. I can get a little messy, so if I can do anything to help keep my counter neat, it's a win for me. Like I said, you want to try to keep things all the same size so they cook evenly. Got this all cut up. And then I wanted to make a spice mixture to put on the squash. Instead of just sprinkling over, I wanted it evenly distributed throughout the whole thing. And I wanted them to make sure that everything got a little bit, especially since I was cooking it in 2 different pans. And now my sage and my rosemary were a little bit, they had bigger pieces in it. So what I did is I put it in the bowl, give it a little squeeze before you put it in there, breaks it up a little bit. And if your rosemary's really dry, sometimes it helps the flavor come out. Give it a good pinch when it's in the bowl. It'll break things up. The sage that I have has a lot of stems in it. I wanted to make sure they got broken up. And we're going to put just a little bit of brown sugar in there, just a little bit of sweetness. Now the sweet potatoes are sweet. You want to give the butternut squash just a little bit of sort of that same sweetness. And the brown sugar has sort of a very slight smoky flavor. Get that mixed up. Break up the brown sugar. Like I said, this helps things get evenly distributed. It makes sure that everything gets a little bit. And I like to put my spices on while the squash is dry because it sticks to it a lot better for some reason. I think because the oil doesn't stop it. We are going to put some olive oil on there afterwards, but if you put the spices on first, it seems to stick to it a lot better. And the same with the salt and pepper. And I did salt and pepper this before I put the spices on. I like to use my hands. They're your best mixer. And then we're going to get just a little bit of oil. I try not to use too much because I do try to keep track of the calories. You just want a nice thin coat on them so when they roast in the oven, they don't dry out and they get that nice little browned roast to them. This turned out so good. I was so pleased with the way it turned out. Whoops. Sometimes they run away. You give it a good stir. You want to make sure everything's coated with the oil. And then this is the pan for the pork. So I decided to try to pick out the pieces that were where the seeds were for this. So they were all this closer to the same size. So I picked out all those pieces and put that in the pan for the pork. And the pork's going to sit on top of those while it cooks. And I cooked everything at 375. I ended up putting the first batch of the squash in, and that ended up cooking for about 50 minutes, which gave me the time to get the pork together. This is a lengthy process to make this. It's easy, but it does take a while. It took me about 45 minutes after the squash was done to get everything together. We make a nice little bed for the pork to sit in. And the rest of the squash, I just put on a foil-lined sheet. Get all those spices out of there. You don't want to waste those. Spread it out and they go in. And while they're in, I'm going to work on the filling for the pork. This is super basic. Lots of garlic. You want lots of flavor in the filling. And I just minced it up. It doesn't matter how you do it. If you want to use the rasp, you can use the rasp to do it. But I didn't want the garlic. Sometimes when you use the rasp, the garlic burns really fast in the pan, so you have to be careful. So I decided to chop it up. And then we'll get a little bit of oil in the pan. Like I said, try to cut back on the oil if you're trying to save on calories. I have a non-stick pan, so a lot's not necessary. Get that garlic in there. You don't want your pan too hot when you put your garlic in. You don't want it to burn. Burns quickly too. You have to be careful. And I did wash the spinach. You really should make sure that you wash your spinach or any kind of greens really well before you use them, because there's nothing that will ruin a recipe more than getting sand somewhere in your meal. Just put them in the sink, filled the sink up with cold water, swished them around a little bit, took them out, pulled the stems off, and cut it down. If you cut it down, it cooks faster. And like I said, this is a very simple filling. You don't want to complicate it. Garlic going. At this point, you can start to smell it. And you always want to have something ready to go in your pan when you're cooking garlic. In case it starts to go a little bit too far, you can get something else in there to stop it from cooking. Get the spinach in there, and then I'll give it a good stir, and I'll try to get the garlic off the bottom of the pan and mixed up in the spinach so it doesn't burn. And it only takes a few seconds of the spinach being in there. Some of the moisture starts to come out, and then that will give your garlic that safeguard. And once spinach is done, you get it in the bowl. I have breadcrumbs, feta cheese, salt and peppered the spinach while I was cooking it. And just give it a good stir. I know it looks a little bit dry, but you don't want it real wet. You don't want it runny at all. And as it's cooking in the pork, the juices from the pork get in there and moisten the stuffing up, or the filling, whichever you want to call it. We just want to get that stirred up really well. Get the breadcrumbs in between all those little spinach leaves to get it separated. And this is a pork loin. It was almost 3 pounds. It was like 2.75, something like that. Now, when I do this, I like to have the fatty side up. And this is nothing fancy. Just a couple of slices in there. Slice down the side there. Spread it open. And then you're sort of cutting and rolling a little bit. It did cut through, but it didn't make a big deal. Just push it together again. Press it down. Try to get it same size all around. It really doesn't make that much difference, but it makes things a little bit more consistent if you can do that. Salt and pepper really well before we put the stuffing in, because this is the salt and pepper for your meat. And I know it looks like a lot, but it really isn't. It ends up being about a half a teaspoon. And we want pepper in there. So I like to use the salt and pepper shaker. You can get everything nice and even. And now we'll get our filling on. Like I said, this really is a very basic, very easy dish to make. It just takes a lot of steps. And we're going to spread it out. Make sure it's even. If you'll notice this, the filling's not as dry as it was before. Breadcrumbs have started to soak up some of the moisture of the spinach. And they are plain breadcrumbs that I used. And then you want to sort of, once you get that all spread out, you're going to follow the same lines basically as where you cut. So I kind of took my hand and scored where I pressed down where I had cut, just to make it a little bit easier to fold it. Sort of makes a little seam in there. Makes it easier to fold over. Keeps the stuffing, the filling where you want it. You roll it up, turn it over, and see you've got the fat on the top part. When that cooks, that'll render out and it'll melt and it'll run down, and it sort of bastes it as it's cooking. Get washed up, and I'm using string. Now there's many ways that you can tie this up. You can get really fancy, but it's not necessary. A couple pieces of string. You want to keep it together. This helps it keep its shape. It helps it cook evenly. It helps keep the filling inside of it. I ended up using 4 pieces. It's not a big deal. Just regular kitchen string I used. Almost cut them a little too small, but we were good. Get it all tied up. One thing you have to remember is take the strings off before you cut it. Yes, I have forgotten to do that once in a while. Get that all tied up, and then that's going to sit in that bed of butternut squash. And then after that, we're going to make a glaze to go on top of it. Now, the glaze is definitely a new one. I've never done this glaze before to put on top, and it turned out so good. Has a lot of flavor in it. Counter cleaned up a little bit. Like I said, I'm not always the neatest, so where I find a chance to clean up, I try to. So the glaze does have a few different flavors in it. Some might seem a little bit odd, but I wanted to use just a little bit of the brown sugar because I do like that smokiness that it gives. And it's not a lot, so you're not going to get a lot of the sweetness from it. And then we're going to put some lemon juice in there. That gives you a nice little acid in there that you need sometimes. It rounds your flavors out, it's called. It makes things more than one dimension, more than one flavor. Get the lemon juice in there. It's just a half a lemon. Try to keep the seeds out. I didn't do a great job of that, so I had to fish them out. But it's only about a tablespoon, just a little bit. And it helps make your glaze a little bit easier to spread too with that liquid in there. Get that little bugger out of there. And then we want some Dijon mustard, which of course is always hard to get the last little bit out, but I hate to waste it. And I didn't need that much. It was only 2 tablespoons. Get that out of there. And now this is the different ingredient I've never used before. I thought I'd give it a try. And it's just plain horseradish. It's prepared horseradish. It's it really, and I didn't use a lot, but it just adds that little bit of, I don't want to say heat, but just that little bit of heat. It's not spicy. It's sort of the way wasabi is. If you've ever had wasabi, it hits you in a different spot in your mouth. I use the same spices throughout the whole dish. Everything that I used on the squash, I used in this little glaze. And like I said, I wanted to make sure that the bigger pieces of the rosemary and the sage were broken up. So I did that in my hand. just to make sure you don't have any big sticks or anything in there. And I wanted it just a little bit looser, so I did add some oil to it. The oil also helps protect the top of meat when it's cooking, stops it from drying out. But you don't need a lot because there is that little bit of fat that's on top of the cut of meat. Get things cleaned up a little bit and give it a good stir. Make sure it's well combined. Make sure it's the right consistency. And then the pork's on the squash in the pan. Spoon this over. Now, I tried to keep a little bit more of the glaze on the top so when it cooked, it would run down the sides. But I did also want the sides covered in a little bit. So just spread it out. Put an even coat over everything, but leave a little bit more on top. Like I said, it added such a wonderful flavor. That horseradish really made a big difference. And this goes in the same temperature that the other tray of squash went in, 375. And it cooked for an hour and 25 minutes. The other squash is in there, so take that out and test that with the fork. They were nice and tender. They were all done. I was surprised. They only took about 45 minutes to cook. That was about how long it took me to get everything else together and get the pork stuffed. Take that out, put the pork in. And it smelled so good when it was cooking. Oh, the house smelled wonderful. And when it's done, I always use a meat thermometer to check. And so you can do pork at 145 degrees. I like mine 150 to make sure, especially if it's stuffed, you want to make sure that that inside is really done. So I cooked it to 150. And then you let it rest. Don't ever cut your meat as soon as it comes out. All the juices will just run right out of the meat, and you want those juices to stay in there. And there we are, getting rid of the strings. Like I said, that's an important part. You don't want to skip that step. Now, I cut bigger slices because, well, it's just me, and it was easier to keep track of the calories of the meat with the bigger slices. And then I ended up, the slices that I used for my servings were half. The bigger slices are easier to cut too. But you could serve, this would serve 8 to 10 people easily. Especially if you're serving other side dishes along with it. But it was absolutely delicious. It was very tender, nice and juicy. And I had fun making it. Now, if you wanted to put this on the table whole with the butternut squash in the pan that you cooked it in and cut it at the table, that would be fine too. I cut it and put it back in the pan, which looked nice too. So you could serve it so many ways. It was absolutely delicious. And it made for good leftovers too. I think I got 7 or 8 slices out of this. And they, like I said, they were thick. So if you wanted to make them thinner, you could. And you could serve more people with it. It's not an expensive cut of meat, but when you cook them the right way, they turn out and really make it feel very luxurious and expensive. But very juicy, very tender. Made a great sandwich too with the leftovers. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this recipe and I hope you give it a try. It's definitely worth the time. Happy holidays, everybody. Again, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.